Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me for part 2 of our story tonight. And what a fascinating story it is. We have Barker, who's a young boy of 11 years old. He's just received a text message from his friend, Felix, who is telling him that he needs to meet him in the woodgrove because he has a secret to convey to him. So we're going to find out what happens next, but it's all very, very exciting. But before we do so, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with part 2 of our story. It was over dinner that night that my mother noticed I wasn't making much of a showing on my evening meal, and concern dappled her piercing ice-blue eyes. She studied my plate rather fixedly, and I could easily read her thoughts, as if they were as unambiguous as an open book. "You're not hungry, Barker, I see," she said, raising a questioning brow. "Now that is a first. When have you not had second or third helpings? What on earth is up with you? You've barely made any showing on that plate of yours." My father, who ate his food at the speed of a rocket in takeoff, looked somewhat bemused by my overfull plate that I was struggling to work my way through. Normally I was so like my father in this regard, and would bolt down all my food faster than a starved dog, and usually I was eager to demand both second and third helpings, but not tonight, it would seem. My mind was a million trillion miles away, as I thought about the big, wonderful secret that Felix had to convey to me later that night, when the clock moved closer to the witching hour. There was something so uncannily bewildering, yet at the same time enigmatical, about the urgency of Felix's text that had both succeeded in rattling me and intriguing me. I wondered what the mystery was all about, and why it was so poignantly important to meet Felix in the dead of night like this, at such a godless, unholy hour. What could be so desperately important to tell me that it strictly had to be told to me under the cover of darkness in an inauspicious woodgrove known to be haunted at night by the ghost of Deirdre Horace herself? It would seem the thrill within my body was being messily tangled up with an earnest sense of disquiet. I will admit I was so caught up in the babble of my curiosity that I was involuntarily suppressing my primal instincts to eat, for my hunger for some reason had simply abandoned me, and even the delicious savoury aromatic smells of my mother's steaming, piping hot food did nothing to stimulate what I would normally describe as an insatiable appetite on my part. "Son, this is not like you," said my father, who was working his way through his second helping of stewed beef and creamy mashed potatoes by now, and was currently greedily shuffling down a forkful of beef and potato in his mouth, as if desperately afraid that if he didn't eat his food fast enough, a voucher might swoop out of nowhere and steal his dinner away from him. My mother would complain tirelessly that me and my father ate far too fast, so much so that we barely got an opportunity to even taste our food. "You're as bad as each other," she would regularly say. "Do you not know how rude it is to shovel your food down like this? Can you not eat a little slower, perhaps? And try to be gracious enough to pause between mouthfuls. I'm sure it's not healthy to gobble your food down so rapidly, without even chewing it first. It can't be good for you. If you ate your food a little slower, you might actually enjoy it more. I would be absolutely mortified, I have to tell you, if any of my friends were to see you right now. They would think you were starving the way you polish off your food on your plates. And I have a suspicion, if I weren't looking, you'd lick your plates clean too. You could both learn some good manners. We can do all that polite stuff and eat slowly when we're around our guests, or if we're entertaining friends," my father would say to my mother. "But at home, me and Barker can eat as we please. And when I'm hungry, I always eat fast. I've always been like this, love. You know that about me. Why change the habits of a lifetime? And for your information, I do taste my food, thank you very much, and enjoy it just as much as the next man. I'm sure that eating food fast doesn't mean you miss out on the taste." "Really? Is that how you see it?" my mother would say, looking a tad exasperated. "Sometimes I despair with the both of you, I really do. It wouldn't hurt to mind your manners from time to time." But I'm afraid my mother's words fell on deaf ears, for extreme hunger dictated how fast me and my father usually ate, and we always seemed to be ravenously hungry by the time dinner came around. In my case, I suspected I had an insatiable appetite because I was growing up fast. In 2 months my feet had grown so much bigger that my mother had to replace my new shoes that I had already outgrown. While my father's case was straightforward enough, as he was a physically very big man, not only in terms of his height, but his strength as well. He probably needed way more calories than your average man. And my father's feet were so enormously big, my mother struggled to find his shoe size when they went shopping together, and on several occasions she'd actually ordered shoes straight from Norway, as they had a much wider range of sizes for men like my father, with bigger feet. My father could eat absolutely anything he wanted, without gaining a single pound of weight. My mother described our stomachs as like 2 bottomless pits that could never be filled, satiated, or satisfied. She was always bitterly complaining that her food bill was excessively steep, due to the unfortunate fact that both me and my father ate way too much. Whenever she went to the supermarket, our 2 trolleys were stacked to the nines and piled high with so much food they barely managed to contain it all. It looked like my mother was feeding an entire army. Some shoppers would casually ask my mother if she happened to be having a party. She'd simply nod her head politely. She didn't want to tell the people, "No, my family gets through all this embarrassingly large quantity of food in a single week, along with this insane amount of ice cream, because they're big eaters." She didn't want to tell them that. It was ironic on this occasion she was complaining on my poor showing this evening. You'd think she'd be glad I wasn't bolting down my food like a half-starved animal for a change. But she wasn't happy about my poor showing that I had made that evening. Probably because it was so out of character for me to show zero interest in my food. "Your father's absolutely right," said my mother, unable to disguise the maternal concern in her voice. "You're not coming down with something, are you, Barker?" She reached over to run a hand over my forehead as she tried to test my temperature. "Or a fever, perhaps, are you?" "No, I'm not," I snapped. "I'm fine." I was at an age when I always winced when my mother touched me. I hated being fussed over. It felt so patronising. Felix's mother, Glenda Featherstone, was always touching me as well, and looking at me with adoringly pathetic eyes. It rarely made me want to heave, for I absolutely abhorred being fussed over like this. I often wondered privately to myself if all women were wired to be like this. "Well, I'm very glad to say your temperature's normal, dear," my mother said, finally retracting her hand from my forehead. There was concern in her eyes as she studied me like a hawk, as if she wanted to ensure that she hadn't overlooked something. Finally she said in a more softer but guarded tone of voice, "Someone hasn't upset you at school, have they, Barker?" She asked me, her jaw stiffening, as she waited somewhat impatiently for my response. The look she was giving me was as potent as a truth serum, so had I been lying to her, she'd have known about it at once. My father once again looked up from his dinner plate. His chewing slowed down substantially, as worry also washed over his face, rather like an ominous dark shadow. "Son, if something's troubling you, or someone said something to upset you at school, I hope you would tell us about it. There are no secrets in this household. You cannot fix a problem if you don't talk about it, can you? You must always tell me and your mother what's going on at school, or if someone is bullying you, as me and your mother would never stand for such nonsense." I was somewhat taken aback that my parents thought I might be being bullied, for goodness sake. I mean, it just made me smile, the very idea of it, given I towered over them all, rather like a giraffe over a scattering of rabbits in a field. No one would dare bully me at school. I was the tallest boy in the class. Sometimes I did get called String Bean because of my great height, but if anyone tried to screw with me, they wouldn't stand a chance, as I was so much bigger and stronger than they were. "Well, that's an awful relief," said my mother with a happy sigh. "You had me worried there for a moment, Barker. You really did." My parents were not the kind of people you confided in, for they would address any problem I had as tactlessly as a raging bull in a china shop, and I knew that very well from experience. When I was 8 years old, for example, and I wasn't particularly big at that time, like I am now, as the growth spurts happened much later on in my life. A boy in the school, I don't remember his name, was in the playground and he punched me in the face. The next thing, my mother was paying the family a visit to tell them what their son had done to me and how I'd been unfairly bullied by him. The boy in question was severely reprimanded by his parents, but he let it be known at school among all the other kids that I had run to my mummy and daddy because I was such a big baby to tell them what he'd done. Everyone began to call me a tattletale tit and a big wuss who couldn't fight his own battles unless he called upon his mummy and daddy for support, which was deeply humiliating for a young boy. Ostensibly from the ages of 7 to 9, I was a small kid, but by the time I reached 10 years old, I shot up, and those same kids would never dare to challenge me, as let's just say physically, I could overcome them all in a fist fight, and they would be the ones that would end up drawing the short straw. It was well known at my school among my peers that if you had an issue with me, my mother would soon sandwich herself in the heart of the matter with the same bulldozing fierceness and tenacity of a dung beetle, determined to involve herself in every issue and get caught up in all the dirt it might entail. This was hugely embarrassing for an 11-year-old, so even if I were having issues at school, I would never tell my parents about it, for I would be teased mercilessly if that were the case. Both my parents were quiet for a brief moment, and a rather unnatural silence descended across the dinner table, as my father's chewing had all but subsided, so much so that you could have heard a pin drop. My parents' piercing ice-blue eyes were fixed on me steadily, as they seemed to think that I should be giving them a full explanation as to why I had suddenly lost my appetite. If I wasn't hungry, for goodness sake, I wasn't hungry. Why wouldn't they accept that? There wasn't anything abnormal about not being hungry. I could feel the familiar annoyance building up inside me. I didn't believe all parents were like this. They needed to know everything about me, everything that I did. Why I wasn't eating, why I was wearing a red t-shirt, why I hadn't finished my homework yet. You cannot believe the questions they assaulted me with on a daily basis, most especially my mother, who sometimes made me feel as if I was being interrogated by the police themselves. It would seem all the whys they spat out at me regularly had become increasingly infuriating. Sometimes I struggled to contain my annoyance. Having said that, I also found that Felix's parents were equally as bad as mine were. They incongruously also wanted to know so much about me as well, the details of my life, when it was no business of theirs at all. They treated me like a second son, so the interaction between both of the families was more than a little bizarre, to say the least. But I was used to the Featherstones' heavy involvement in my life, and how both families appeared to watch over the both of us, like hawks, and I never understood why. When my mother picked me and Felix up from school, she seemed to interrogate the both of us on the car ride home. She was always embarrassingly the first parent to arrive at the school gate, 15 to 20 minutes before all the other mothers. Felix lived next door to us, so it made perfect sense for her to give him a ride home, to kill two birds with one stone, so to speak. My mother insisted on picking me up from school every day, even though Felix and I could easily have caught a school bus, or even been part of a lift club with other parents, but my mother would have it no other way, and didn't trust anyone to ferry me around, apart from herself. It would seem that even with Felix in the car sitting right next to me, my mother shamelessly, unabashedly wanted to know every aspect of our day, and was as nosy about Felix's thoughts on things as she was of mine. Whether she was doing this to be polite to Felix, I was never quite sure, but she seemed to be equally as interested in what Felix had to say for himself as she was in what I had to say. She appeared to smile at him intimately, in the same way that Glenda Featherstone would smile at me. She would ask us all kinds of stupid questions, like what we'd learnt in English that day, what the teacher was wearing, what did we talk about in the school playground. My mother's questions were excruciatingly embarrassing, but Felix was a good sport, and answered all her questions politely. He had been raised to be respectful of his elders, and my mother appeared to have such a soft spot for Felix that it sometimes made me jealous. I once accused her of liking Felix better than she liked me, which she became incredibly defensive about. "What are you talking about, Barker? Felix is your best friend. Of course I like him. I ask him questions because I'm interested in him. What's wrong with that? But you're my son. You come first in everything. It's always been that way." "Then why do I sometimes feel that you like Felix better than you like me?" "For goodness sake, Barker," my mother had snorted. "You do only half talk nonsense sometimes." I wasn't so sure I was talking nonsense. I knew my mother really, really liked Felix, and sometimes I privately wondered if she'd prefer it if he were her son, but I kept such thoughts to myself. My father was very demure by nature. He wasn't a particularly talkative person. But he was also meddling and prying when it came to me and Felix, always asking us way too many questions. When I asked other children at school if their parents behaved like my parents did, I was met with a resounding no. So why on earth were my parents and Felix's parents so intrusive? I couldn't answer that question. Maybe my mother and Felix's mother hung around each other too much, and they became like two birds of a feather, rubbing off on each other in some way. There were times my mother would insist that I could not go on a school camping trip with my classmates or on some other school expedition that would take us further away from home. I would ask both of my parents why I couldn't go on this camping trip, and my overprotective mother would simply say, "What if something dreadful were to happen to you, Barker? How would I be able to protect you?" "I'm not a baby, Mum. I can look after myself. All the other kids are going. Why can't I go? Why are you so mean?" "Don't talk to your mother like that," my father would say. "Your mother's looking out for you, that's all." Felix's mother, Glenda Featherstone, would also resolutely refuse to let her son Felix go out on any of those extra-school events. She and my mother were practically joined at the hip and agreed on absolutely everything that was being discussed. If I wasn't going on a school camping trip, neither was Felix, and that was that. The discussion was closed. The decision was final. There was absolutely no negotiation about the matter, even if our school teachers tried to persuade our parents otherwise, that it was in our interest to go. Our parents would just point-blank refuse. The irony is that our parents, although regimentally protective towards the both of us, despite their strict rules, they would let me and Felix cycle to the Woodgrove, which was on a trail behind Ian Fiersing's property, at the cul-de-sac at the bottom of our street. It was here we would spend hours together happily at the creek that ran through the woods, and was our quintessential place to hang out. It occurred to me that bad things could happen as easily to us close to home here in the Woodgrove, but I never challenged my parents on this thought, for fear they would suddenly ban us from going into the woods altogether, and I couldn't allow that to happen, because bang would go our freedom. I will say this, that there was something strange about the way the Featherstones had shamelessly weaved their way into our family's lives, almost as if they had become part of the furniture, more so than even our grandparents. Even when we went on family vacations, the Featherstones always joined us. If that wasn't weird enough, every weekend without fail, our two families always enjoyed a Sunday barbecue together. It was almost as if the Featherstones had become part of our extended family, even though they weren't remotely related to us. My mother was closer to Glenda Featherstone than she was to her own sister. It was hardly surprising that in these unfathomable circumstances, Felix and I became the very best of friends. We were always placed together, rather like two marbles being put into a velvety bag side by side. I'm not sure that we'd have actually been best friends by choice, if we didn't happen to live next door to each other and spend copious amounts of time in each other's company, or because our parents appeared to be very close. I never fully understood or appreciated why this was the case. I do vividly recall telling Granny Ina about how overbearing my parents could be towards me at times, and she was very sympathetic and understanding about it. I do recall in her pale blue eyes that were icier looking than mine, I had noticed a melancholic sadness in their depths, almost as if she was nursing an old memory that she really did not want to entertain. She had shaken her short-cropped head of snow-white hair and said, "Well, with what your parents have been through, can you blame them for being so overprotective towards you? Sometimes when you've had a nasty shock in life, it can really rattle up your entire world and change the way you do things." I had asked Granny Ina what she meant by this. Her face had grown pink, as if she was blushing. She hastily said, "Don't mind me, Barker. I'm just talking over my head. I don't half go on sometimes." "But what do you mean exactly, Granny Ina?" I had inquired. But Granny Ina ignored my question and promptly changed the subject, so obviously that I unequivocally knew she was hiding something from me, and I had a burning itch to know what it was. It did make me wonder what may have happened to me when I was younger that would have made my parents so overly protective towards me. It occurred to me that maybe I'd nearly drowned in a swimming pool as a little boy, as my parents might have come close to losing me, so it would make sense to me if they continually watched over my life in the obtrusive, meddlesome way that they obviously did. But I kept such private thoughts to myself. I knew if I had nearly drowned in a swimming pool accident, my parents would never speak of such a thing, even if it had really happened. My mother had an irritating habit of brushing things she didn't want to discuss under the carpet. By all accounts, Felix shared a similar complaint to mine about his parents when we secretly aired our grievances together, usually when we were sitting on the bank by the creek, over the fact that our parents always seemed to be watching over us, rather like eagles watching over their younglings. We were both amazed they allowed us to go exploring in the woods and gave us that kind of freedom, given how proprietorial and possessively dominating they were. We both complained bitterly that at times we felt as if we were under 24-hour surveillance. "There is nothing going on, all right," I snapped that evening at my mother, as I toyed awkwardly with my food on my plate, slamming my fork angrily into the piece of beef that was so tender it broke apart. "I'm not hungry, that's all. It's no big deal. You're acting like it's a big deal, but it's not. I'm just not hungry." My mother took away my plate, along with my father's empty plate, and released a heavy sigh, which I was sure was deliberate. "There is no need for you to snap at me, Barker. Me and your father are concerned about you, that's all. You normally love your food so much, so when you're not eating, I'm entitled to worry. That's what I do. I'm your mother. I tell you what, how about I get you some ice cream? I've got your favourite snickerdoodle ice cream in the freezer. I know how much you love that flavour. How about I throw some sprinkles on it for you? Make it extra special, as a treat." "I don't want snickerdoodle ice cream. I don't want sprinkles. Haven't you heard a single word I said?" I scoffed. "I told you, Mum, I'm not hungry." My mother was so taken aback by my sardonic retort, she looked as if I had delivered her a blow to the face. I was so irritated. My parents were all over me, like a burgeoning rash, simply because I wasn't eating my dinner that night, and I felt as if I was being smothered and unduly suffocated by them. As a result, I got up from the table and said, "I'm going to my bedroom now." "When you get up to leave the table, Barker," my mother retorted wryly, "it would be very nice if you would courteously say, 'Please, may I be excused?'" "May I be excused, Mum, please?" I said satirically. "That is so much better, Barker," my mother said, giving me a mock smile. "Of course you may be excused. Thank you for asking." As I walked away, I heard my mother's anxious voice saying to my dad in a muted whisper, "What on earth is going on with Barker? He's so angry tonight, so defensive and moody. He didn't touch his food. It's not like him to toy with his food like that. He normally wolfs it all down and asks for second and third helpings. And I've never yet known him to refuse snickerdoodle ice cream, especially with toppings." "Leave him be," my father said. "You worry far too much, love. Maybe our son needs some space. If you think this is bad, wait until he becomes a teenager.
My guess is we haven't seen anything yet. He's going to get feisty when he gets older, and will likely think we're butting into his life. Let me tell you, when I was a teenager, I abhorred my parents' intrusion. They used to annoy me so much.
Oh, goodness gracious me, I heard my mother say.
Please don't say that. I would hate for Barker to make enemies of his parents. He's so special to me. He's my entire world.
When I got into my bedroom, I texted Felix and told him that everything was on schedule and I would meet him at 12 that night. His response was very clear and concise. "See you then. You're not going to believe what I have to share with you. When I learned this, let me just tell you, I flipped." Suffice to say, Felix's text rather meant that getting to sleep that night was more than a little difficult. At 9 o'clock my mother entered my bedroom with a tray containing a glass of milk and a plate of chocolate chip cookies. She put them down on my desk in the corner and smiled coyly at me.
"Just in case you get hungry, love, during the night," she said.
"Thanks, Mum," I said, watching my mother close the bedroom door behind her and blowing me a kiss. I hastened to say I didn't touch the milk and cookies my mother had kindly brought me, because I wasn't hungry. I set the alarm on my cell phone diligently and played a few games to distract myself, but my mind was not focused on the games, as all I could think about was what it was that Felix had to tell me that was so secret. I was thinking that I would never get to sleep, as I had become so alert, but against the odds I drifted off and was awoken to the pinging sound of my cell phone going off. I reached over to my bedside lamp on the nightstand and switched on the light. So the dark shadows in my room retreated and bounced back, and everything was washed in a subdued glow. I quickly stared down at my cell phone to check the time. It was 15 minutes to 12. I had time to get dressed quickly and to slip out of the house via my bedroom window, making my way to the bottom of the street on the bicycle, where I would wait for Felix at the head of the beaver trail that ran down a path at the bottom of Ian Fierceling's rather dilapidated bungalow. I observed the glass of milk on my desk that my mother had left me, and realizing I was thirsty, I swigged it back, very gratefully. But at this point it was no longer warm and about to turn, so it didn't taste desperately pleasant. I quickly tiptoed over to my closet and threw on a pair of olive green chinos, some sneakers and a navy blue sweater, and then I placed a couple of pillows in my bed, underneath the covers, and artfully arranged them so it looked like a human body was sleeping in my bed. I did this in case my mother should look in on me during the night, and hopefully if she did, she would assume that the lump in the bed was obviously me. I then quietly glided over to my bedroom window, drew back the curtain ever so slightly, and I held my breath as I did my level best to squeeze through the small opening that the window provided, that seemed significantly smaller than I last remembered it to be. But luckily, because I was both long and lean, I slipped through the window with a few careful twists and turns relatively easily, until finally my big ungainly sneakered feet met the bed of grass on the other side of the window. I switched on my torch, even though a soft moonlight unblushingly spilled onto the backyard. The grass beneath my feet appeared to be rather damp. I could hear the crepuscular trills of crickets and frogs. I quickly glanced at the house, but apart from the crickets singing their tuneful chorus, everything was thankfully placidly quiet. I hurriedly ran from the backyard to the front yard, doing so as silently and as furtively as I could, as the last thing I wanted to do was to wake up my parents. By the time I reached the yard shed, I don't mind admitting my heart was pounding rather vigorously in my chest, for just opening the shed door invited a great deal of noise. As I expected, the door rattled, jangled, and precariously clamoured as it was swung open very discreetly. I glanced briefly towards the house to see if any lights would suddenly pop on, but all remained serene and still. I sighed with abject relief, but I knew I wasn't in the clear, not just yet, not until I managed to get my bicycle off its rack. Soon I'd pulled out my jingling bicycle from the shed, and I'd like to say it was a quite seamlessly easy retrieval, but I'm afraid it was nothing of the kind, as the shed door creaked behind me, and the bicycle emitted a few unfortunate squeaks. I waited for a few vital seconds to see if the noises had alerted my parents, but thankfully no light came on in my parents' bedroom. I drew in an inward sigh of relief, because the noises I had made had seemed painfully loud. I guided my bicycle to the driveway and finally mounted it, and hurriedly cycled down the drive until I met the road on our street. In a trice I was cycling past houses on both sides of the street. All basked under the veil of darkness. Their shadowy silhouettes were ambiguously blurred. Finally I reached the cul-de-sac at the end of the road, and felt as if I'd been holding my breath all the way, almost as if I'd been diving underwater and had only just come up for air, rather like a seal under the ice. It was almost as if I was an autopilot as I cycled up the beaver trail, which was behind Ian Fiersing's bungalow, which I could see, like most of the houses on our street, appeared to be cast under a tenebrific veil of darkness, so its dilapidated appearance was shrouded by the dark shadows. But even in this half-dingy light, the bungalow looked somewhat menacing. It was a gloomy night for sure, that was cruelly corrupted by the absence of any light. I felt as if the dim ambience was cloying, for much of the moonlight seemed to have been confiscated by this dense cloud cover that appeared to have even held the silvery stars captive that usually jewelled the nightly sky with vast scatterings of silvery glitter, but not tonight, it would seem. Finally I reached the beaver trail, dismounting my bike very carefully and balancing it against a tree. I discovered that Felix's bike was already balanced against another tree, so he must be here already. Then I saw him. He was already waiting for me, if not rather impatiently. In fact, he looked rather peeved. "What took you so long?" he whispered, a scowl pulling down the edges of his mouth. "For a moment I thought you'd overslept and that you weren't coming. I said 12 o'clock. It's 12:05 already. You're late." "But I'm on time," I insisted. "And anyway, what's 5 minutes? What's the big secret, Felix? Are you going to tell me now or not? I'm bursting to know." "I'm not telling you out here. Not around here," said Felix, looking around himself rather nervously, almost as if he half expected our parents to come crawling from underneath the undergrowth like a couple of raccoons and saying, "We've got you." "I told you, we're sharing the secret by the creek, so only the fish can eavesdrop on our conversation. It's very important no one hears us, especially not our parents. What I have to tell you, well, you're not going to believe it." "But no one can hear us now," I insisted. "We're alone out here in the dark. Most people are fast asleep by now. I don't want to go into the woods. It's so dark in there." Felix gave me one of his challenging looks, so I knew arguing with him was counterproductive, especially when he was like this. But going deep into the woods to get to the creek at this ungodly time of night seemed far too ambitious and like overkill to me. But there was no arguing with Felix, not when he was in this kind of a mood. Felix was holding a curious bundle of well-worn letters in his hand that were tied together with a black ribbon. I assumed the secret he had to share with me had something to do with these letters. Otherwise he wouldn't have brought them along with him. So naturally my inquisitiveness was aroused, but I said nothing as I patiently walked by Felix's side through the woods. We gingerly used the light of our torches to navigate our way cautiously through the tall, lofty trees. And despite the generous light that our torches exuded, it was bodefully inauspicious in the woods. I was experiencing what I can only describe as that insufferable, oppressive, suffocating feeling I always got when my parents nauseatingly began to ply me with hundreds of awkward questions, like they had done earlier on in the evening over dinner, when they demanded to know why I wasn't eating my food. When my parents behaved like this, all I wanted to do was to escape the stranglehold of their well-meaning interrogations. But right now, similarly, all I wanted to do was to flee the woodgrove and cycle straight back home as fast as I possibly could. I was terribly afraid to tell Felix how creeped out I actually was. Every creak from a branch that I heard, that moved in the slight breeze, or a rustle of leaves or hoot of an owl, made me jump out of my skin. I was terrified Felix would call me a wuss, or worse still, tell me that I was scared of encountering the ghost of Deirdre Horace wearing a nightdress covered in blood. The truth was, he'd have been right if he'd said that. I was absolutely petrified of seeing the ghost of Deirdre Horace. How could I admit that to Felix, who seemed incapable of experiencing fear of any kind? By all accounts, I was now a lot less interested in knowing about the secret that he had to convey to me. All I could think about was leaving the Woodgrove. I was itching to go, because something just wasn't right, and a nasty chill had run down my spine, along with an ominous sense of foreboding that clung to my person like an overcoat that I couldn't shake off. Was it possible my current trepidation had something to do with the stories I'd heard about the ghost of Deirdre Horace? Perhaps the thought of her ghostly spectre haunting the Woodgrove was clouding my sense of judgment and filling me with a paralysing fear, the likes of such I had never known before. Let's not kid, we all know the influences of such suggestible, haunting stories can be very disquieting, but I had never felt like this before, not a day in my life. My mother once told me a sad story about a poor man who was locked in a freezer unit at a restaurant kitchen and was desperately convinced he was going to freeze to death. He didn't realise that that particular freezer unit was a cool setting to preserve lettuce and vegetables, and he would never have frozen to death in that. But he was so convinced that he was going to die of the cold that scratches were found on the inside door of the freezer unit in his desperate attempts to escape what he believed would be a freezing incarceration. As a consequence of the crippling fear the man had subjected himself to, it would seem that he was found dead the following morning. Ostensibly, the power of belief had brought on a mock hypothermia and subsequently led to his untimely death. Was this happening to me, I wondered? Was my fierce belief in the paranormal inviting me to experience a heaped overload of frantic emotions that were bringing on a flight and fight response into every cell of my body? So I was rippled with an overwhelming sense of impending dread. How I held it together that night I do not know, but I fought those overwhelming desires to flee from the grove with all my strength and might, which did little to ease my frantic heartbeats that were pounding away so violently in the depths of my chest that I was almost certain that Felix would hear every drum and every beat that would automatically betray to him that I was exceedingly apprehensive. Why was I such a big baby, I asked myself, for I could see that Felix looked undisturbed, nonchalant, and as carefree as he always did, almost as if walking in the grove during the witching hour of the night like this was no skin off his nose. How I wished I could be like him, for Felix never entertained the alarming tale of Deirdre Horace with any credence at all. I glanced nervously over my shoulders at the footpath behind me to check that nothing was there. Why did I have this irksome feeling that something was following us, that something was behind me, that it was watching me, as if eyes were burning in the back of my neck? I hurriedly flashed my torchlight over the dark shadows to subdue them, in the hope that the light could swallow up any tenebrific images that had made me feel so jumpy. But nothing was there. I was beginning to feel a tad foolish. "There's no such thing as ghosts," I repeated in my mind. "There's no such thing as ghosts. There's no such thing as ghosts. There's no such thing as ghosts." I kept saying this to myself, like an ongoing mantra that they don't exist. They don't exist. They don't exist. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I was falling fast behind Felix. He was the one that appeared to be sashaying energetically through the woods, whereas I was literally crawling. I was so nervous. He turned around to look at me. There was an expression of annoyance dappling his forehead, as two great big furrows emerged between his brows, which made him look significantly older than his years. I knew we both had a birthday in common, as we were born on the same day, but truly I was beginning to feel as if I was a kid, and my salient, much wiser friend was the adult among the two of us. He seemed so unfazed by the dark shadows that loomed around us on this creepy, ill-omened night, that felt far more menacing the closer we got to the creek. "What's wrong with you, Barker? Why are you walking so slowly? You're lagging behind me," he said accusingly. "Hurry up, will you? We haven't got all night." "I'm not walking slowly. I'm walking carefully. It's very dark in here," I said defensively, trying to speed up my walk to meet up with Felix, but he was impossibly fast. There was a still breeze blowing among the trees. A few leaves were lifted up on the path and seemed to be flying around like celestial butterflies. It was not a particularly cold evening, but the breeze was significantly cool. And that was when I heard the voice. "Barker! Barker! Barker!" The voice appeared to wail, but it sounded distinctly like my mother. It couldn't be, I thought. It couldn't be. "Did you hear that?" I said, my voice unable to disguise the panic. "I didn't hear anything. What are you on about, Barker? Move on, we need to get walking. We need to get to the creek. You're walking too slowly." "But you must have heard that. Someone was calling my name. I think it was my mother." Felix looked at me as if I was completely mad. "What the hell are you talking about? No one is calling your name. It's all in your head." "But you must have heard it," I insisted. "It was probably the wind," said Felix, looking extremely irritated. "Get a move on, will you? We need to get to the creek." I was now wondering if I was going stark raving mad. I was sure I'd heard a voice calling my name that sounded ominously like my mother's voice, but I had to have been mistaken because Felix hadn't heard anything at all. I was now absolutely convinced that my treacherous mind was playing duplicitous tricks on me, and that my guileful thoughts were misleadingly leading me astray, like the poor man who ended up dying in the freezer unit at the restaurant. Finally, Felix and I reached the creek. Together we sat down on the bank, while Felix began to unravel the black ribbon that tied the collection of letters together. For a moment he was silent, as we listened to the gurgling sounds of the creek. We heard a hoot of an owl, and a sudden flapping of wings, and in the distance the strangled cry of a coyote. Suddenly everything went so quiet, and even the crickets and frogs became mute. But I paid the silence no heed, as my attention was distracted to Felix, who had removed a letter from the bundle, and was opening it up. I stared incredulously at the envelope, for the writing on it looked so familiar. The envelope had obviously been hand-delivered, because on the front were the words, "For the attention of Glenda Featherstone." Why did the writing look so familiar, I wondered, and then I realised it was my mother's writing. "What is it you want to tell me, Felix?" I asked, my eyes fixing on him. I knew whatever it was, it had something to do with the letter he was about to read to me, that was written in my mother's hand. Felix looked up at me soberly. "In these letters I've got some answers to many of the questions we've had over the years about our parents." "What kind of questions have we had over the years about our parents?" I asked Felix, not making any sense as to what on earth he was trying to say. Felix shrugged his shoulders rather nonchalantly and said, "Well, you know, we've often wondered why our parents live in each other's pockets. You have to admit that's strange. Why my mother and your mother are so incredibly close. I mean, they told us how they missed the hospital all those years ago when we were born. But I never believed the story for a second, because I'm not that gullible. I don't know about you. I always wondered why both our families spent weekends at each other's houses, why we live next door to each other, why we spend family vacations together, and why my mother every year buys you an excessively extravagant present, as expensive as the present she buys me. And your mother buys me a very expensive present, like she buys you. Now that's not normal behaviour, you have to admit it. Why would someone that's not biologically related to you, year after year, buy you a very expensive present? You do that with your own kids, but not with friends of the family, surely. I've never made any sense of those questions, until I found these letters, of course, and then everything made perfect sense to me." "The letters are from my mother to your mother," I said, more as a statement than a question. "That's right. The letters are to my mother, from your mother," said Felix. "I'm going to read you this one letter, because in it you're going to hear something that is going to blow your mind. And when I say blow your mind, I quite literally mean a rocket is going to go off in your head, as it did for me. So prepare for takeoff." "Where did you find the letters?" I asked curiously. Felix at least had the good grace to look a tad sheepish. "My mother has a bureau in her study. She keeps it locked all the time. She tells me she's got secrets in that bureau, She hasn't hidden that from me. She says I'm never allowed to go in there. And so what does that do? It makes me naturally curious. So one day I spied on her. I watched where she put the key to the bureau when she locked up. She didn't see me spying on her, but she had this little hole that she kept in the floorboards. There's a crack in there, and that's where she puts the key. So I sneaked in there, and I took the key out of the crack when she went out shopping. So that's when I entered the bureau and looked inside. I couldn't believe what I found. I knew in the letters was going to be a secret, but it was a bombshell when I read what it contained. I could hardly believe it. But you shouldn't have done that, Felix. Your mum told you not to go near the bureau. I don't care about that now. What I care about is what is in these letters, which I'm going to share with you now. Do me a favour, shine your torch onto the page so I can read it to you. I obediently shone my light onto the letter, and Felix read it out loud. Dear Glenda, this has to be the hardest letter I've ever had to write in my entire life, and not a letter any mother should have to write to another mother. I cannot put into words how dreadfully sorry I am that you had to receive such devastating news that was as devastating to me as I'm sure it has been to you, and of course your husband Winston. I am in no doubt that with your son Barker now 4 years old, that you have grown incredibly fond and very attached to the young man, as we have indeed likewise grown to adore our son Felix, who is a bundle of joy and a very clever little guy, with, dare I say, an insatiable curiosity on him that never seems to be quenched, let me tell you. When I learnt the bitter, unpalatable truth that Felix was not my biological son, it tore my entire world apart, into shreds. There is no other way to describe it. Sometimes I think in life it's kinder not to know the bitter truth. The truth can sometimes be very, very cruel indeed. But now the cat is fully out of the bag, we have to deal with it in some way. We can't ignore what we know. When I heard the devastating news, I was furious. I couldn't believe such a dreadful blunder could have been allowed to happen like this in the very first place. My husband Axel comes from the Lundevall family line. Me and my husband have Nordic names. I'm Astrid, my husband is Axel, and we named our son Felix after his grandfather, which is a common name in Norway. Well, as you can imagine, our family is Nordic. The blonde hair and the blue eyes is so typical of my family line. Indeed, I know of no family member that has not been tall with blonde hair and blue eyes. When Felix was born, he appeared to be blonde and blue-eyed, but by the time he was 2, his blonde hair had all but vanished, disappeared, like a passing memory, and had mysteriously grown quite dark. And his blue eyes looked a lot more greenish than blue, which in my opinion was profoundly strange. My husband Axel asked if I'd been having an affair when I fell pregnant with Felix, only as a joke, as many of our extended family members started to comment rather regularly that Felix was unusually small for his age, as our family has always been particularly tall. Axel's mother even said that even at 2 Felix was uncommonly tiny for a Lundevall. Let's just say the dark hair was a first for the Lundevall family, along with the green eyes that were definitely blue when Felix was born. On a whim, my husband decided to clandestinely check our son's DNA. I think he did it more as a joke than anything else, to assure any questioning family members with lingering doubts that Felix was indeed our son. Not for a single second did Axel suspect remotely that Felix was not his son, but he did the test anyway. Axel was in a dreadful shock when it turned out from the DNA results that Axel was 99% not the father of little Felix. As you can imagine, this horrifying news hit my husband really hard. He was so gutted that Felix was not his biological son. Axel even wondered for a brief moment if I'd possibly cheated on him during our marriage. But he doubted that that was the case, as he knows all too well that I've never been the cheating type. I'm glad to say my husband gave me the benefit of the doubt on that one, but he still decided to surreptitiously get my DNA checked against Felix's.
The results shocked and mystified Axel further when he discovered, paradoxically, that I was not Felix's biological mother. When I learnt the news, we both contacted the hospital to access the records of all babies born on the exact same day as Felix was. Initially, they were not very cooperative towards us, and insisted rather curtly that there was no way, under any circumstances, that we would have returned home with the wrong baby. So we got our attorney to deal with the hospital on this matter, and to access the records. We soon discovered that indeed another boy was born prematurely, at exactly the same time and at the same hospital as little Felix, and the woman who'd given birth to her son was called Glenda Featherstone. We managed to get further information about you from a private detective that we hired, called Mark Zuckerberg. I know it was wrong of Axel to surreptitiously take some of your son's DNA without your knowledge, but Axel actually felt it was the most ethical, sensitive, and emotionally kind thing to do for you in the circumstances. I know it sounds anything but. I guess he didn't want to tell you there was a possibility that your child may not be your biological kid, in case there was some oversight, and our assumptions were all wrong, as the last thing we'd want to do is to drag you into this tangled mess, if it could possibly be avoided. Axel found a baby's bottle with a dummy attached to it, lying in your outside bin that had been thrown out because the side of the bottle appeared to have been cracked. Axel knew it must belong to your 4-year-old, as you did not have other children. So Axel managed to take a swab from it, and it matched our DNA. So we are definitely the parents of your little boy, Barker. The news was a shocker, let me tell you. Now we know for sure that your son Barker is our son, and your son Felix is ours. How do you deal with something like that? We've both been placed in an impossible position, which can only be described as a parent's most horrendous nightmare. You don't expect to return home from the hospital with the wrong baby, do you? I delivered prematurely, as so did you, due to complications, and premature babies look very alike, especially when they're tiny, I believe. When my baby was born, he was blue. We were so worried our baby was not going to survive, being so desperately underweight. We never really got to study our baby closely enough. He went straight to the incubator, you see. I understand from the hospital, if I'm getting this right, that both babies were born prematurely, within a minute of each other or so. They were taken together to the incubation facilities by 2 nurses. For some reason, the nurses got confused as to which baby was which, and electronically tagged them wrong. The problem with babies being so premature, as ours so obviously was, they look so alike at that age. I have spoken to our attorney. There is some legal action we can take against the hospital, but I am sure as parents we both want to raise our real biological children, as we both intended on the day we left the hospital to begin our journeys as mothers. We never expected to be taking home a stranger's child, or to grow so attached to the child in question that we believed to be our own. None of this is remotely fair, and in the beginning, when I learnt the horrifying truth, I felt like this had to be some cruel, malicious joke. I'm not sure how you want to proceed from here. You're welcome to take as much time as you need to get your head around all this. I certainly needed plenty of time. The idea of giving up Felix is doing my head in, and maybe you would prefer it if we kept our non-biological children as our own. I would be happy to keep Felix, but I would also very much like to raise my own biological son. My husband Axel would like to do a swap, as he's insistent we should be raising our own children. We could, of course, go the legal route over this debacle, but I hatched up a plan of my own that might just work, provided you agree, of course. And if both families are on board with it, let me know what you think. It occurred to me, if we lived close to each other as families, our children could grow up together side by side, so that you could continue to be very much involved in Barker's life, as I could be involved in Felix's. We could do a straightforward swap that way, without involving the courts, and continue to be actively involved in each other's lives. So you can keep an eye on Barker from a healthy distance, and I can watch over Felix. It is inevitable, in the circumstances, that we will never stop loving each other's non-biological children. as we raised them for 4 years as our own, believing them to be our true children. So we're bonded with our kids. It's a significant amount of time, 4 years, to grow very attached to a child. On the brighter side of things, of course, if there is one in this huge, inexcusable debacle, I have persuaded myself that it could have been a whole lot worse for us if we'd found this out when the boys were a lot older. That would have been so much more traumatic, especially for our children. Luckily, our children are only 4 years old at this age, and as a result, they will have no memory of their early lives. If we agree to do this, we need never tell our children about this grievous mistake that was made by the hospital, as why would they need to know any of this at all? I'm not exactly sure how you will feel about my rather unorthodox idea, but if we are involved in each other's lives in this way, we will never have to let go of our non-biological children that we have grown to love as our own. When I learnt I might have to give Felix up, it hit me hard like a thunderbolt to the stomach. But at the same time, I also wanted to be raising my biological son, which is perfectly understandable. I think if we worked things out this way, we would be gaining and not losing. I know you need a lot of time to process what has happened. God knows I did. But when you and your husband Winston have discussed how you would like to proceed from here, please let us know. Kind regards, Astrid. So there we are. That is the end of part 2 of our story. Part 3 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.